The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal God, restore us and bring us back to you. Give us back the joy we once felt in your presence. By your mercies, we have navigated through dangers, toils, and snares. Mighty God, you have been faithful. Today, give our senators the wisdom to seek your guidance. May they daily read your word to find light for the road ahead. Lord, help them to experience the certainty that comes from embracing your precepts. Inspired by reverence for you, may they find and stay on the right path. We pray in your sacred name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., March 2, 2021. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Raphael G. Warnock, a senator from the state of Georgia, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to legislative session. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Quorum? No. Thank you, Mr. President. Now, today the Senate continues its steady progress in approving highly qualified nominees to serve in the executive branch. Last night, the Senate confirmed Dr. Miguel Cardona as the Secretary of Education. Millions of jobs and trillions of dollars have been taken but the job is not complete. The American possible. And to defeat this evil disease, one to end through action the current state of the crisis and hasten the day when our country and all of our lives can return to normal. The bottom line, if you look at the trajectory, every time we put in a relief bill in March, the economy got better. In June and July. We put a relief bill in December, and now the numbers look a little better for January. But the economy is not strong enough to sustain things on its own. We need strong relief to get the economy going so it can continue on an upward path on its own. That's what this bill is designed to do. I fear most economists, Secretary Yellen, Chairman Powell, if we do too little or nothing, the economy could stay mired in recession for all too long a time, just as it did when we didn't do enough in 2009 and the economy stayed in recession for many years after the financial crisis. Now, on voting rights. In our American system, we talk a lot about perfecting our union, a reference to the preamble of the Constitution, a document which effectively gave only white male landowners the right to vote in our fledgling democracy. Suffice it to say, there is a lot of perfecting to do. As I think about my Democratic caucus, incidentally, it's probably so that less than half of them could actually vote in the election. Despite all this progress, there is now in the 21st century a concerted effort to roll back voting rights in state legislatures across the country, alarmingly making it harder for Americans to vote, and particularly aimed at Americans of color, African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. And it's becoming a feature of one of America's major political parties. Yesterday, I detailed a number of laws pushed by Republicans in state legislatures to limit the amount of time that Americans have to vote, to frustrate election administration in urban areas and around college campuses, to impose overly burdensome ID requirements and absurd written witness and signature requirements for absentee ballots. Maybe most pernicious of all, Republicans in Georgia have coalesced around a plan to end all early voting on Sundays, a day when black churches organize voter drives, with no good reason given. None. The threat to voting rights in America is now very real. It must be opposed in every state house and governor's mansion in this country. And the threat extends all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. 8 years ago, a conservative 5-4 majority on the court gutted the Voting Rights Act by essentially rendering meaningless Section 5 of the statute, a provision which prevented the implementation of undue voting restrictions in states with a history of discrimination. Chief Justice Roberts suggested that the era of widespread discrimination, which led to the enactment of the Voting Rights Act, was over, and there was no longer a need for the critical portions of the statute. Well, within 24 hours after the ruling had been handed down, Texas announced it would implement a strict voter ID law. Soon thereafter, Mississippi and Alabama followed with laws that had previously been barred by the Justice Department. Republican leaders in the state of North Carolina passed a suite of voter suppression laws that a federal judge found, quote, targeted African American voters with surgical precision. Think about that. This was not a ruling from the Reconstruction era or Jim Crow. It was only a few years ago. At a time when an African American man elected by the most diverse coalition in the history of American politics occupied the White House, Republicans in North Carolina passed voting laws so pernicious that even the Roberts Court, among the most conservative we've seen on this issue of voting rights, could not ignore the overwhelming stench of discrimination. That's what it was, a stench, rooted in America's sordid history of voter suppression and discrimination against black voters. Well, today the Supreme Court will hear another case concerning the Voting Rights Act, this time about Section 2, a section which Chief Justice Roberts referred to in his Shelby County ruling as a necessary fail-safe to police discriminatory voting procedures nationwide. As one news outlet reported this morning, there is every possibility that the High Court could make it more difficult or practically impossible to challenge voting restrictions in the future, unquote, warning that another ruling against the law could render the Voting Rights Act, quote, a dead letter, unquote. That is what's at stake in America right now. As state legislatures move to restrict voting rights from one end of the country to the other, the law we rely on to prevent outright discrimination at the ballot box is at risk of being, quote, a dead letter. This is one of the most appalling things I've seen in this country after 4 years of an appalling administration. This is just incredible. It burns my blood and should burn the blood of every fair-minded American, Republican, Democrat, Independent, Liberal, Conservative. After centuries of expanding the right to vote, of struggling to get that right to vote, these pernicious, self-serving proposed laws to cut back on the right to vote. Will the Supreme Court let that happen? So against what America's all about. So, we cannot stand by and do nothing as these rights are diluted or stripped away. Congress must pursue a restoration of the Voting Rights Act, and by all accounts should be working in a bipartisan way to make it easier, safer, and more convenient for all Americans to vote. The judgment of history has never been kind to those who work against the full participation of their fellow citizens in our democratic experiment. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader is recognized.
There's been a lot of discussion about the Democrats' decision to load up their partisan spending bill with liberal items that are completely unrelated to the pandemic. We're at a key turning point in this crisis. The nation has just endured an historically painful year. The virus has stolen 500,000 American lives. It's thrown millions of children out of classrooms and workers out of jobs. But on every front, there seems to be signs we're actually turning the tide. New cases, hospitalizations, and deaths have been declining. The CDC reports that 1 in 5 adult Americans have already received at least one vaccine dose. That's 50+ million people. 1 in 10 have gotten both shots. And the supply of vaccines is continuing to ramp up, and yet another authorized just last weekend. Meanwhile, science keeps confirming it's quite safe to get kids and teachers back in the classroom with simple precautions that we can accomplish right now. And all indications suggest our economy is poised for a roaring comeback for workers and for families. This crossroads should give Washington a golden opportunity. We could get together on a bipartisan basis like we did 5 times last year, 5 times, and pass more targeted policies to help finish the fight and get the American people their jobs, their schools, their lives, and their country back. A number of Senate Republicans went to the White House just days after President Biden was sworn in, proposing we continue the streak of overwhelming bipartisanship that has defined the COVID-19 response all this time. Our Democratic colleagues said no. They wanted to go it alone. And when you look at their partisan bill, you can certainly see why. Less than 9% of their massive proposal would go to the core healthcare fight against COVID-19. And listen to this, less than 1% goes to vaccinations. You see, they had to leave room for all the completely unrelated left-wing pet priorities, like sending $350 billion to bail out long mismanaged state and local governments, multiple times the expert estimates of COVID needs. Things like massive expansion in Obamacare subsidies that would disproportionately benefit wealthier people. Things like handcrafted tweaks to Medicare so it pays more money to just 3 states, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and the president's home state of Delaware. You might call it a special kickback for the Excella corridor. They had to make room to bankroll things like underground rail in Silicon Valley, upgrading a bridge from New York to Canada, and giving Planned Parenthood access to taxpayer money meant to rescue mom-and-pop Main Street businesses. Sadly, the parts that actually do relate to the pandemic aren't much better. At the same time, the Democrats refuse to follow the science on in-person schooling. They want to pass a massive new set of deluxe benefits for federal government employees, including 15 weeks of paid vacation for folks whose children have the option, just the option, of virtual or even hybrid learning. They want to keep schools closed and then pay a special bonus only to parents who are federal employees because their schools are closed. Now, this isn't a recipe to safely reopen America. To the degree that it even addresses the pandemic, it's more like a plan to keep us shut down. Mostly, it's just what Democrats promised almost a year ago, taking advantage of the crisis to check off unrelated liberal policies. Now, Mr. President, on another matter, we recently learned that Iran has balked at the prospect of direct nuclear negotiations with the United States and Europe. This sort of resistance and gamesmanship is nothing new. We've seen this before. Iran has long flouted international restrictions on its nuclear program, played hide and seek with UN inspectors, and failed to disclose the full scope of its nuclear research. This happened before, during, and after the Obama administration's Iran deal. Now, thanks to the firm approach taken by the Republican administration, which restored much of the leverage President Obama had thrown away, President Biden inherited a much, much stronger negotiating position. Let me make it clear, Republicans do not oppose nuclear diplomacy. We hope the administration will secure a better, stronger, and more lasting deal than President Obama's. But to do so, President Biden's team must avoid the mistakes of the JCPOA. Here's how you do that. Coordinate closely with partners and allies who are most immediately threatened by Tehran, and treat Congress as a partner to be consulted, not a problem to be managed. And most importantly, don't give up any leverage for free. Of course the mullahs are playing coy. They want concessions before they even come to the table. In December, after President Biden was elected, Iran's parliament reaffirmed their intent to continue acting out if sanctions were not eased. Well, I hope it is only the Iranians and not the administration's negotiators who need this reminder. Look, the United States holds all the cards. President Biden is the commander-in-chief of a superpower. There are no circumstances, none, in which Iran should get money for nothing. And there's no need to rush into the talks. The administration should take care not to squander our upper hand just to spite the last administration. Nor should President Biden's team discount the value of the growing regional unity against Iran that is embodied in the new Abraham Accords. Every day, headlines remind the world of the threat Iran and its proxies pose to peace and security. For example, the Iranian journalist Ruhollah Zam was lured back to the region from Europe, kidnapped and hanged after a sham trial just in December. The Lebanese activist Raimond was an outspoken critic of Hezbollah until he was shot dead in his car. The regime has kept escalating its support for the Houthi rebels in Yemen, sending in deadlier, longer-range weapons and inciting terrorist threats. The Houthis have escalated attacks on Yemen's neighbors, including in civilian areas, and launched a military offensive that jeopardizes the peace negotiations being undertaken by UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths. Just last week, an Israeli civilian shipping vessel pulled into port with a gaping damage from a missile attack. And Tehran's pet militias in Iraq have fired rocket barrages against our own American diplomatic and military facilities. They're communicating to the Biden administration in the mullah's preferred language: violence. Like I said over the weekend, President Biden was right to respond to this threat by authorizing strikes against targets belonging to Iranian proxy groups. The right decision. And he is right to recognize the need for new binding and enforceable constraints on Iran's nuclear capabilities. But ultimately, we need a comprehensive approach to confronting Iran. It must be built on bipartisan foundations to endure for administrations and Congresses yet to come. To get there, the administration must continue to meet Iranian aggression from a position of strength and consult closely with Congress for the sake of our own security and that of our friends and partners in the Ayatollah's backyard.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, Department of Commerce, Gina Marie Raimondo of Rhode Island to be Secretary.
Yes. Whoop.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I've come to the floor on several occasions now to talk about this $1.9 trillion spending bill that will be soon before this body. I've talked about different parts of the bill on different occasions. I've talked about the mandates, the bailouts, and the billions and billions of dollars of spending completely unrelated to coronavirus. Now, these are all reasons enough to oppose this piece of legislation. Today, I'd like to talk about another problem that I see with the bill, and that's that this bill would now subsidize health insurance far beyond what was ever imagined when the House and the Senate passed the Obama health care law. Way beyond the subsidies ever envisioned in that. One analysis shows that this bill would give a family of four making close to $250,000 a year, family of four making close to $250,000 a year, up to $9,000 in free subsidies for health care. Now, that's not 4 times the poverty level, that's almost 4 times the average income of a household in the United States. You know, government aid is supposed to be for those who need it, people who can't make it on their own. But that's not been the focus of the Democrats with this legislation. This legislation is not about coronavirus, not about coronavirus testing and vaccination. They've already been paid for, so that someone who wants to get a test or gets a vaccine, they get it. It's paid for previously. The vaccines are free. We don't need additional money to pay for the shot. We voted on that last year. It's the law of the land. This new proposal with these additional subsidies is just going to get us this much closer to one-size-fits-all socialized medicine. Now, Democrats have realized for many years that the Obama health care law has failed America. They know it's unaffordable for working families. People understand that the co-pays are so high, the deductibles are so high, that people that have been mandated to buy it found that they didn't really getting any value for their money. Many people I've talked to said with Obamacare, the premiums were so high, it was actually higher than their mortgage at home. Well, Republicans want to lower health care costs, actually the cost of care. Democrats seem to just want to raise what government pays. And Democrats are also trying to pressure states into expand Medicaid. There are about a dozen states that have chosen not to expand Medicaid. Now, I'm a doctor. I know the importance of Medicaid. I know the importance of providing care for people who cannot care for themselves. Often that is families, low-income families, pregnant women, patients with disabilities. You look at the original intent of Medicaid, huge value for the American people, but not with what they've seen with the Obamacare expansion. We should work together for these most vulnerable of individuals so that they can get the care that they need. Yet, it's not what Democrats are doing with this proposal, not with the additional subsidies, not with the additional expansion of Medicaid. They're trying to bribe states to give free care to able-bodied working adults. Not to people that were originally intended to be helped by Medicaid, but for able-bodied working adults. Mr. President, those are people who ought to be getting their health insurance through their job, through work. That's the best way this works for them, insurance that they can use without these extraordinarily high deductibles and copays that we see with Obamacare. The contrast could not be cleaner, Mr. President. Republicans are offering the American people a stronger economy and opening schools. That's what we ought to be focusing on. Democrats in the health care law is subsidizing health insurance for the rich. It's astonishing. You wouldn't think it would be that way. It doesn't make sense. It's not coronavirus relief. People need relief now. They want their kids back to school. They want to get back to work. They want to put the virus behind them. That's not what I see in this $1.9 trillion bill that the Senate will soon be considering. Only $1 out of 11 of this $1.9 trillion bill actually goes to help get people back to work, kids back to school, focuses on the health care components of coronavirus. The kids back to school component, you say, well, there's money to put kids back to school. 95% of that money doesn't even start to get spent until 2022. The coronavirus crisis is going to be beyond us and behind us by 2022. Mr. President, we should be working together, targeting support for the American people who need it the most, not subsidizing people who don't actually need the subsidies. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
Ms. Baldwin.
Time out.
Mr. President,
Republican Whip.
Senate in a quorum call.
Yes, it is.
I would ask unanimous consent the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, Democrats continue to push forward with their partisan COVID legislation. The House of Representatives passed the Democrats' $1.9 trillion partisan wish list on Saturday, and the Senate is expected to take it up later this week. Just weeks after the President expressed his commitment to unity at his inauguration, he and his party are forcing through exclusively partisan legislation despite Republicans' clear willingness to negotiate. Mr. President, when it comes to the Democrats' COVID bill, President Biden keeps asking, what would you have me cut? As if there's no way anyone could dispute the necessity of anything in this legislation. Well, Mr. President, as I said last week, I have some suggestions, because this bill is rife with unnecessary and problematic provisions. Democrats are presenting this as a COVID relief bill, but a lot of this bill has little to do with responding to the pandemic. In fact, Mr. President, less than 10% of the bill is directly related to combating the COVID health crisis. If President Biden would like to know what to cut, let me suggest starting with the bill's $350 billion slush fund for states. Now, there's no question that COVID has placed additional pressure on states, which is why Republicans supported targeted funding for states in previous COVID legislation. But at this point, the vast majority of states are not in crisis. A number of states actually saw higher tax revenues in 2020, and a majority of states, including my home state of South Dakota, have the resources that they need to weather the rest of the pandemic. Even if the federal government bailed out those states that are still struggling, some at least partially because of their own mismanagement, $350 billion far exceeds the amount that would be needed. Democrats are simply providing a large and unnecessary giveaway to states with the distribution formula heavily weighted in favor of blue states. Then there's the bill's funding for schools. Now, Republicans are committed to getting schools reopened so our kids can get back to the in-person learning that they need. It's why we voted for $68 billion in COVID funding for K-12 schools last year. But right now, Mr. President, schools don't need additional funding. So far, K-12 schools have spent just $5 billion of the $68 billion that we provided them. Yet the Democrats' bill would provide nearly $129 billion in additional funding. And despite all that additional and unnecessary money, nothing in the bill would require schools to actually reopen. Schools could collect this money while still depriving students of the benefits of in-person learning. And another thing, Mr. President, Democrats are billing this legislation as a COVID relief bill and suggesting that it's providing urgently needed funding. Yet 95% of the bill's money for schools, 95%, would be spent after this year. That's right. Just 5% of this quote-unquote emergency funding would be spent in 2021. The rest would be spent between 2022 and 2028. Are we really supposed to believe that money that would be spent in 2028, years after the pandemic is likely to be over, is somehow urgently needed COVID relief funding? Well, Mr. President, I could go on for a while here with suggestions for what to cut in this bill. I'm pretty sure that $100 million for a Silicon Valley underground rail project doesn't have a lot to do with getting our country out of the COVID crisis. Or how about the $1.5 million for a bridge in the Democrat leader's home state? And then there's the $86 billion bailout for multi-employer pension plans. Billions for environmental policies, and a provision to ensure that Planned Parenthood and labor unions can apply for Paycheck Protection Program loans designed to help small businesses. I'm not sure how far that will go toward helping our economy, but it will certainly help fill the coffers of some of Democrats' political allies. Mr. President, if Democrats were really just focused on COVID relief, this would be a much smaller and targeted bill. But Democrats' ambitions were much larger than just addressing the COVID crisis. As a Democrat political operative famously said, never allow a good crisis to go to waste. Well, Democrats have taken that advice and are using the COVID crisis as cover for a whole list of partisan priorities with potentially very negative consequences. The Democrats' COVID bill runs a very real risk of overstimulating the economy, as evidenced by the large increase we've seen in money supply, which could, among other things, drive up prices on the goods that Americans use every day. In other words, inflation, Mr. President. Even some liberal economists have sounded the alarm over the size of the Democrats' coronavirus legislation. And then, of course, there's the danger posed by further driving up our debt. Now, we had to borrow a lot of money last year to meet the demands of the coronavirus crisis. And while it was money we needed to borrow, we need to be very aware of the fact that we added a substantial amount to our already very large national debt. We need to be very careful about any additional borrowing and ensure that we're only borrowing what's absolutely necessary. I think it goes without saying, Mr. President, that the more that we borrow, the more debt we have to retire. If something negative happened on interest rates and interest rates normalized, went back to a more normal setting, that the interest itself on that amount of debt would literally dwarf anything else that we do in our budget, including defending the country. And that, Mr. President, I believe is a very, very real threat. Because if you look at what's happening right now with the economy, and with all the money that we've flooded out there so far, and another $2 trillion if the Democrats have their way in this particular proposal, and all that money out there starts pushing up those costs, we start seeing inflation in the economy, it doesn't take very long for interest rates to go with it. In fact, they already are. And if those interest rates start pushing up very quickly on the amount of debt that we are piling up, financing that debt, the amount of interest, the cost of interest on that debt would be absolutely overwhelming and devastating to this country. And so, Mr. President, we need to be very, very careful about any additional borrowing and ensure that we are only borrowing what's absolutely necessary. And that means making sure that anything we do in terms of additional pandemic relief is targeted and fiscally responsible. And that does not include money for a bridge in New York or a taxpayer bailout for mismanaged states. Mr. President, it's deeply disappointing that Democrats chose to turn their backs on bipartisanship. Republicans were ready to work with Democrats on additional targeted relief. And as I have pointed out before, the pandemic has been an issue on which, at least up until now, there's been very much bipartisan support. Last year, when Republicans were in the majority, we did five coronavirus bills, all bipartisan, all done at the 60-vote threshold that governs most legislation that moves through the Senate in a cooperative way. In this case, the Democrats are plowing forward, pushing this legislation in a very partisan way, Mr. President, and I think that's unfortunate, given our history on this issue of bipartisanship and the importance of making sure that we are doing the right things on behalf of the American people to help them get through this pandemic. choosing to pursue a partisan process allows Democrats to stuff the bill with unnecessary spending and political payoffs. But that is not the way to help our country or our economy recover. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I ask the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have 5 requests for committees to meet during today's session in the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I come to the floor today to urge my colleagues to support President Biden's nominee to be Secretary of Commerce, Governor of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo. Many people know that Governor Raimondo was the first woman to serve in that position of her state, and she has made tremendous impacts to that state at a time when it needed important leadership. So we're very excited that the President has nominated her for this position and that she will put those same skill sets to work here in Washington. The mission of the Department of Commerce, at least according to their website, is to foster, promote, and develop foreign and domestic commerce. Well, I can tell you she's going to inherit a big challenge because obviously our domestic economy is still reeling from the impacts of COVID-19 and certainly needs to think about the continuing transition to a digital economy in an information age, and the foreign economy that she's also will be charged with trying to help and impact as it relates to the United States is certainly plagued by the same pandemic and the impacts of that. So we're looking for someone who can come in and help with private sector experience to really move the agenda of this administration forward. So for me, Governor Raimondo's private sector experience really means a lot. She knows how to invest in new technologies and things that are going to help us grow jobs for the future, and she knows how to match up a workforce with those job opportunities that is also so critical as we move forward on many, many different policy issues that are going to usher in change. As governor, she invested in workforce training and matching workers with relevant small business experience called her Rhode Island Job Initiative. The program served over more than 1,700 employers and 11,000 people throughout the state. She was able to send her state's unemployment rates tumbling to a 30-year low simply by doing a really focused job of matching workforce training to the needs of those industries that were growing in her state. So I certainly appreciate the fact that she has that private sector experience about knowing where to invest and bringing people together, and she certainly created successful programs on matching the workforce for tomorrow. But make no mistake, the Department of Commerce is going to have a very challenging role as we try to deal with the impacts of COVID-19. One of the most important responsibilities, I believe, will be dealing with the sectors most hard hit by the COVID pandemic. I'm glad that Governor Raimondo is the governor of a coastal state, because one of the most impacted industries we've seen is the seafood industry, which is affected greatly by COVID-19 since early January 2020, when the lockdowns in China and around the world impacted the fishing seafood sector. U.S. seafood exports to China dropped by 31% in January of 2020 and 40% by February of 2020. Lobster, Dungeness crab, shellfish, and everything was experiencing severe declines, and West Coast fisheries have seen as much as a 40% drop in revenue. So sustainable fisheries are important economic drivers in coastal communities. I know that Governor Raimondo gets that. She understands that commercial fishermen and the impacts that they have will impact not just seafood processors, shipbuilding, trade, but also our restaurant economy. And marine anglers took in more than 194 million fishing trips, which fueled our outdoor recreation and tourism economy. So I'm glad that Governor Raimondo, from a coastal state, is going to come to oversee some of those key functions at the Department of Commerce, particularly at NOAA, and harness the incredible data and information to manage these economies that keeps them safe and keep them focused on science. I know that she understands that as secretary, she can use those good scientific agencies within the Department of Commerce to better understand the impacts of climate and the impacts of COVID and what we can do. We know in the state of Washington that just a little bit of science done at the University of Washington helped us immensely in saving our shellfish industry. Now we need to do more for fisheries across the United States. We need to invest in things that I call salmon infrastructure to keep, as we continue to grow our economy and continue to move forward on infrastructure, that we're also keeping ways to return salmon. I think that this is one of the most important things that Governor Raimondo can do as Secretary of Commerce: restore the respect for the scientific process, the scientific community, and the important issues that are going to be at the heart of how our coastal economies are impacted by climate. I've invited Governor Raimondo to take one of her first trips to the state of Washington to see exactly how our state has dealt with these fisheries issues. And I know that the presiding officer from California knows how important the seafood industry and the impacts to our coastal communities because of climate are as well. We need a leader in the Department of Commerce who's going to help us mitigate and adapt to those impacts. I'm also counting on Governor Raimondo to help us with our export economy. Everything from our ports to farmers to aerospace. Exports mean jobs, and about 1 in 4 jobs in the state of Washington are related to trade. So frankly, I think she's a departure from the last president and the last Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross. I think he and the president spent a lot more time shaking their fists at the world community than engaging them on policies that were really going to open up markets and help us move forward with getting our products in the door. 96% of the world's customers live outside of the United States, and prior to the COVID pandemic, half of the world's population had reached middle class. That means that's a big market, almost 4 billion people. U.S. exporters need to be able to reach those markets and to grow the U.S. economy and grow U.S. jobs. We need to work with our allies like Europe and Japan to meet the real challenges we face from China. We need to expand U.S. exports in other fast-growing markets around Asia and South America and around the world. And the Department of Commerce has a key role in promoting those exports, helping our companies enter new markets, and U.S. Commercial service officials are on the front lines of these issues around the globe. So I know Governor Raimondo understands the importance of this export market, and she understands that the Department of Commerce can play a very big role in it, and I hope that she will get to work soon on working within the Biden administration to make this a big priority. And I also want to say that I know that she is going to, on other science agencies within the Department of Commerce, play a critical role. Everything from the National Institute of Science and Technology, a small agency that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it is very consensus-based on standards and fostering growth in a number of industries that are so important to communications and manufacturing and public safety. And so I hope that she will use, again, her private sector experience in knowing where to invest in new technologies to help us continue to grow economies like the space economy that we have in the state of Washington. We're very proud that we have, as commercial space travel has started to be a major focus of the private sector, have grown many businesses and many jobs in our state in that area, and we want to see it continue to grow. But we need Governor Raimondo's leadership on the important policies that divide us on these issues. The U.S.-EU Privacy Shield Agreement is such a negotiation. I know my colleague, Senator Wicker, who's been very involved in these discussions and negotiations, know exactly how important digital trade is, and commerce is leading up these talks to resolve these disputes. We must ensure the continued free flow of commercial data between the U.S. and Europe. A lot is at stake. U.S. and that this is the same, as I said to the presiding officer. I know he gets how important digital trade is to the state of California and would like to see these issues addressed as well. So, Mr. President, these are very big challenges for the Department of Commerce and the next Commerce Secretary to basically make sure that the impacts of COVID are dealt with in our economy and to usher in a new era of an information age by making the right investments and depending on science, to help our key coastal communities that also have been greatly impacted using and harnessing the aspects of NOAA, and really bringing in the type of leadership we need at the Department of Commerce to resolve our problems as a new digital age emerges here on an international basis and continue to allow our economy to grow. I know she's the right choice. I urge my colleagues to support her nomination. And Mr. President, I thank the President. I yield the floor and suggest an absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, this week our Democratic colleagues are striving to break Congress's perfect record of bipartisan pandemic relief. Last year, 5 relief packages were signed into law, each with overwhelming bipartisan support. No bill received fewer than 90 votes here in the Senate, and one even passed unanimously. The reason why these bills receive such broad support is because they address the crisis at hand in a targeted manner. No controversial provisions or unrelated partisan priorities, just clear-cut relief for the American people. As I said, the perfect record of common sense bipartisan relief packages will apparently end this week. The bill our Democratic colleagues are preparing to bring to the Senate floor have been drafted by only one party. As you can imagine, that process lends itself to a sort of partisan Christmas tree decorating. Democrats have taken the framework of the COVID relief bill and added a range of liberal priorities that have absolutely nothing to do with COVID-19. A Silicon Valley subway system, a blank check for mismanaged union pension plans, a bridge from New York to Canada, and funding for climate justice. It's no surprise that this bill passed the House on a strict party line vote. But the COVID-19 relief label isn't fooling anybody. This is a partisan wish list that does more to advance a political agenda than to respond to the legitimate public health and economic needs of our country. That's why our Democratic colleagues have chosen to abuse the budget reconciliation process in order to make a law. And based on the price tag of this bill, you would think it was March 2020 all over again. Despite the fact we have made serious headway in vaccinations, that our economy is recovering by leaps and bounds, and all signs show we're moving toward that light at the end of the tunnel, our Democratic colleagues are prepared to spend another $1.9 trillion of borrowed money. That's about half as much as all previous bills combined. What's even more concerning than the cost is how the money is going to be spent. One great example is funding for education. So far, Congress has provided more than $110 billion for K through 12 education, including $68 billion in the relief bill that was signed into law just in December, just a couple of months ago. Schools in Texas have used this money to update air filtration systems, purchase personal protective equipment, and implement regular disinfecting so students and teachers can safely return to the classroom. After all, we know in-person instruction is best for our children. I have sections of my state where at least a third of the lower income students don't have dependable access to broadband, much less the kind of supervision that they would need in order to continue their learning. Study after study have shown that kids have fallen behind while learning virtually, especially in foundational subjects like math and reading. And the learning deficit is even greater for students of color and those in high poverty communities. One study found that for math, white students began this school year about 1 to 3 months behind in learning, while students of color were more likely to be 3 to 5 months behind. And the impact on our students isn't purely academic. As we know, there are serious mental, social, and emotional tolls to be paid as well. We need our schools to open, and of course we need to do so. The experts tell us not only is that possible, but it has already been done in states across the country. The Center for Disease Control published a report in January that found, and I quote, "There's been little evidence that schools have contributed meaningfully to increased community transmission," close quote. The lead author of that report affirmed that even in places with high infection rates, there's no evidence that schools will transmit the virus at a higher rate than the general community. In short, schools are not a breeding ground for COVID-19 as long as appropriate precautions are taken, and they can reopen safely. The good news is there's already plenty of funding to make that happen. In December, the Center for Disease Control estimated schools would need about $22 billion to open safely. As of February the 9th, of the $68 billion that was provided for K-12 schools in the combined relief packages, only about $5 billion has been spent. $68 billion has been provided and only $5 billion has been spent. Despite clear evidence that 1, kids are struggling with virtual learning, 2, schools can safely reopen with the right precautions, and 3, that there's plenty of funding to help schools implement these measures, our Democratic colleagues are prepared to spend another $130 billion for K-12 education without any sort of incentive or requirement for children to return safely to the classroom. Sadly, many of our school children are coming up on the 1-year anniversary of their virtual learning. And unfortunately, there seems to be very little momentum for letting those students return to the classroom, and unfortunately, by default, they are falling farther behind. Since most of the existing funds remain to be spent, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that the bulk of spending of this new proposed funding would occur next year and beyond. In other words, this isn't an emergency relief bill designed to deal with a present need. This is about spending money in 2021, after which, hopefully, virtually everybody in the United States is vaccinated and we've established herd immunity. Only $6.4 billion would be distributed through September of this year, and the remaining $122 billion would trickle out the door through not just 2021, but through 2028. That is, the majority of the education funding in the so-called misnamed COVID-19 relief bill wouldn't even be touched until the pandemic has been put in the rearview mirror. Now, I've advocated for funding to help schools prepare for a safe return to the classroom. And of course, the experts, as I said, have told us that more than enough funding is already available to make that happen. So I ask, what is the rationale for asking the taxpayers to foot another $130 billion bill if there's no need for that funding in the first place? And I would add to that, this is not money that actually exists. This will be money borrowed from future generations that is added to the deficit and to our debt. There's certainly no excuse to ram this and a range of other partisan priorities through Congress without the support of a single Republican. It was January the 20th when I thought that President Biden gave a very eloquent and appropriate speech at his inauguration, talking about the need for the nation to heal the divisions, to heal, and for unity. But doing this partisan reconciliation bill, when there's no demonstrated need for this deficit spending, is not healing the divisions in our country or promoting unity. Saturday will mark 1 year since the first COVID-19 response bill was signed into law. Since then, we have tragically lost more than 500,000 of Americans. Families have struggled with job losses, small businesses have closed their doors, and children have fallen farther and farther behind. The list of hardships endured over the past year is long indeed. But now our colleagues across the aisle are trying to capitalize on that pain by passing the so-called and misnamed COVID-19 relief bill that does more to advance partisan goals than to bring an end to this national nightmare. It does nothing to get our kids back in school or our American workers back on the job. It doles out taxpayer dollars for favored infrastructure projects. These are colloquially called earmarks, like the bridge in the Majority Leader's home state of New York and a subway system in the Speaker's home state of California. What do those have to do with COVID-19? Where's the emergency there? Why should we borrow money from future generations to fund these infrastructure projects that have nothing to do with the pandemic? We can deal with infrastructure, and we should, going forward, but opportunistically exploiting the public's concern about COVID-19 in order to fund these infrastructure projects in New York and California is simply inexcusable. Only 1% of the funding in the massive $1.9 trillion bill goes toward vaccination efforts. We all understand that vaccinating the American people is the key for ending this crisis. So far, and I'm sure I'm a day or so behind, a couple of days ago we had vaccinated 68 million people. 68 million vaccinations, perhaps. Some of them involved 2 shots. And we are vaccinating people at the rate of 3 million shots a day. That's really, really encouraging. But only 1% of the funding in this $1.9 trillion bill goes toward that eventual key to unlocking the future. And as I said, every penny that's spent on pandemic response is borrowed from our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. Somebody's going to have to pay the money back. Not us, not now, apparently. So we're going to borrow the money, add to deficits and debt. As Larry Summers and others have said, we're even risking inflation by throwing so much money into the economy so quickly at a time when it's growing at more than 4% a year. And we're not, if this effort is successful, spending this money responsibly. Being responsible means doing what is needed, no more, no less, to bring this pandemic to an end and get this country back on its feet. Mr. President, I think this bill is a shameful waste of taxpayer dollars, and it's outrageous that it's entitled a COVID-19 relief bill when so little of this bill actually deals with the pandemic. As we say where I come from, if you put lipstick on a pig, it's still a pig. Well, Mr. President, I didn't know our colleague from New Mexico was going to be the presiding officer now, but being our next-door neighbor, maybe he'll appreciate a little short speech about Texas Independence Day. 185 years ago, on March the 2nd, 1836, Texas adopted its Declaration of Independence from Mexico. This happened in the context of a struggle that perhaps is best remembered by the Battle of the Alamo, which laid some of the groundwork to the Texans, or as they called themselves back then, Texians, eventual victory. I always remind people that virtually everybody died at the Battle of the Alamo. That was actually the Battle of San Jacinto that won the war. But just 1 week shy of that momentous day, a 26-year-old lieutenant colonel in the Texas Army named William Barrett Travis and his fellow soldiers were outnumbered nearly 10-1 by the forces of the Mexican dictator Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Colonel Travis wrote a letter that has arguably become the most famous document in Texas history. Here in the Senate, both Republicans and Democrats from Texas have had the honor of reading that letter, every year since 1961, when then Senator John Tower began that tradition. So today I'd like to express my gratitude for these Texas patriots, many of whom would go on to serve in the U.S. Congress, including Sam Houston, whose Senate seat I am honored to occupy. And it's my great honor to read the Travis letter here on the Senate floor. The letter was addressed to the people of Texas and all Americans around the world. Fellow citizens and compatriots, Travis wrote, I am besieged by 1,000 or more of the Mexicans under Santa Anna. I've sustained a continual bombardment and cannonade for 24 hours, and I have not lost a man. The enemy has demanded a surrender at discretion. Otherwise, the garrison is to be put to the sword if the fort is taken. I've answered the demand with a cannon shot, and our flag still waves proudly from the walls. I shall never surrender or retreat. Then I call on you in the name of liberty, of patriotism, and everything dear to the American character, to come to our aid with all dispatch. The enemy is receiving reinforcements daily and will no doubt increase to 3,000 or 4,000 in 4 or 5 days. If this call is neglected, I'm determined to sustain myself as long as possible and die like a soldier who never forgets what is due to his own honor and that of his country. Victory or death. Signed, William Barrett Travis. As I said, Mr. President, in the battle that ensued, all 189 defenders of the Alamo gave their lives. But they did not die in vain. In fact, we Texans might not be around if it weren't for them. We might still be part of Mexico. The Battle of the Alamo bought precious time for the Texas revolutionaries, allowing General Sam Houston to maneuver his army into position for the decisive victory, as I said, in the Battle of San Jacinto. For 9 years, the Republic of Texas thrived as a nation. That's the reason we fly our flag at the same height as the United States flag, unlike other states. But then in 1845, we were annexed to the United States as the 28th state. Every single day, I'm honored to represent the people of my state here in the United States Senate, an opportunity that would not be possible without the sacrifices made by brave men like William Barrett Travis 185 years ago. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would thank my colleague from Texas for sharing the Texas letter with us again this year. It is always inspiring to hear those words, to remember the sacrifices that were made in Texas. It reminds us all of the sacrifices that are made daily across this country by people who love this country and stand for its unity. So thank you, Mr. President, to my colleague from Texas. Mr. President, I come to the floor today because the Senate will likely vote soon on the Biden stimulus bill. I think all of us in this chamber agree that we want to get relief for the American people. That was our objective when we passed the CARES Act last year, which allocated $2.2 trillion for the relief effort. It was our objective when we passed 4 other COVID relief bills in 2020, and these brought the total up to $4 trillion.
Hi there.
All of these measures were the result of bipartisan cooperation and negotiations.
The stream will
Democrats
continue,
and
if
Republicans
possible,
working
but other than
together.
that, the stream will be ending.
But right now, the president and congressional Democrats are pushing
Oh,
a
I'm sorry, I'm just getting
completely
word
partisan
that the
product
stream will stay
through a
on until
totally partisan
11:15.
process
So
to
5 more
promote
minutes and
their
then the stream will
progressive
end.
agenda.
We are very sorry for any
They call it
technical
the American Rescue
difficulties
Plan,
or any
and the price tag
inconvenience,
is
but the stream will be
$1.9
ending due to
trillion,
double streaming, which will cause
more than double
immediate lagging
what we
in both
spent
streams. Thank
after
you.
the financial crisis starting in 2008. When combined with the 5 COVID packages we've already enacted, the total cost to the American taxpayers would be close to $6 trillion, more than the GDP of every country other than China and the United States. And as of the end of January,
Stream is ending.
hundreds of billions of dollars from these bills has yet to be spent. December's relief bill